Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you are. I'm Neil Cohn, and I'd like to talk to you now about a project about automatically generating news comics with BBC News Labs. BBC News Labs aim to undertake a project where they could generate short comics about important health stories. And they asked, could they do this sort of automatically generated comics? This is part of a larger orientation towards what's called vertical journalism, which is essentially press release journalism, where they produce important, up-to-date news releases of current events and issues, especially in health and science. This project was undertaken primarily by David Caswell and Robert Mackenzie, as well as the team from BBC News Labs. I was brought in because of my work on visual narratives and comics with the perspective of giving an orientation to this work from my theories. So in my work, I have emphasized that the structure of sequential images is similar to that of language, where you have features of linguistic structure permeate across graphic representations in similar ways to what they do in verbal representations. That is, there's a visual vocabulary that's made of an encoded graphic schemas that are produced for producing visual images. And these are encoded across a grammatical system that orders those units into meaningful sequencing. So within this visual vocabulary, you can see in a sequence like these three Peanuts comics from Charles Schulz. These all appeared from different times in the run from Peanuts, and they all feature Linus, possibly with Snoopy. What you might notice is that Linus is depicted in almost identical ways across all of these panels, or parts of him are generated in similar ways. Similarly, same representations are used to show Snoopy running or just Snoopy's back leg. So whether the whole or parts show systematic, repeated forms. So essentially, what this means is that drawings as a whole are composed of systematic pieces, that if you have a database that is full of these sorts of systematic pieces, you could essentially generate comics that use these properties. So the aim by BBC News Labs was to target articles related to the health desk, things about mental health, nutrition, lifestyle, and wellness, which are, of course, increasingly important for today's current climate. So the question they asked was whether they could expand the reach of this sort of journalism through social media like Instagram. In particular, could they expand to markets that are typically less engaged with news, might have lower literacy, or might be multilingual? So the first phase of this project was to see what sorts of comics could be created and whether people would find them appealing or not. So this began with what are called structured story templates, which are basically story templates that guide a reader through different stages of content. This is the "you should care about this" story template, which progresses from describing the importance of an issue, providing the evidence, and then reinforcing that importance with some sort of practical advice. In this template, we looked at a news story about whether obesity could increase the risk of getting cancer. So we took this basic template of a story progression, and I sat down with David Caswell and Robert Mackenzie and worked out basic news comics that I storyboarded or did in thumbnails in comic speak like this. So we created a simple news comic based on this script. Now, the aim was not just to create a news comic, but to create one that had images that could possibly be repeatable in some sort of stored representation for a visual vocabulary that could be generated across numerous examples. So using this storyboard, their design firm, Complete Control, created several different iterations of each comic that had different visual styles. And these were then given to focus groups, which arrived at this particular visual style that you see here. So this is the comic that was based on the storyboards that I had originally created. And what you might notice is that some of the elements here are a little bit different than what we had originally designed, but this is where they ended up given the storyboards. So the idea here is that with these elements, you could automatically generate news comics that have a systematic presentation of panel sizes Those panels could be presented on a website in a spatial layout similar to traditional comics. And they could also be presented in an app, one panel at a time, like Instagram, where you could flip through each panel one at a time. So with these initial versions, they wanted to test the effectiveness and see if this would appeal to people. And so they did a pilot test in November of last year with mock-ups in the UK that had 151 participants, mostly female. And they also did tests in Indonesia with translated versions to see a different sort of perspective across cultures. In fact, these data were so promising that many people wondered if the surveys in fact were broken. And so they did additional testing as well on these, following up on these initial tests. So here are some of these results. What they found is that when asked about whether these news comics held their attention, 73% of people gave positive ratings. That would be a 5, 6, or 7 on a 7-point Likert scale. 74% gave positive ratings about the visual appeal of these news comics. 91% said that these were easy to understand, and 79% said they were engaging to read. All very positive responses. With this, they entered phase 2 of the project, which aimed to create prototypes of these types of news comics. For example, the essential flow works something like this. You have these structured story templates that guide how these stories progress. You then have a journalist who enters the text of the story into these templates. Based on that text, the text pulls from a lexicon of visual components that have a variety of combinatorial variants. The original text and then the generated images are then combined in the finished comic panels of the story. So the 250 components that comprise this visual vocabulary were designed by Complete Control, and they were optimized so that you could have reusable elements. So in the example that I already gave, you see, for example, this scale repeats across multiple panels. This panel, which has a man and an arrow, in fact has both of those elements appearing in other panels as well. The man appears in a panel like this, and the arrow appears in a different direction for a totally different meaning in another panel as well. So it has a generative quality. Also, by my advice, the elements that are comprised in these components could link to text that not only relates to the literal depictions, but also to metaphoric depictions. So something like a target with arrows could be used to talk about the hitting aims and goals for research projects or health issues. Images related to weather, such as storm clouds or a sun, could be related to not only literal depictions like seasonal affect disorder, but also things like depression for storm clouds or happy moods for sun. So 100 of these visual components came from the prototypes that were developed by Complete Control. An additional 135 of these components were created by mining 7,000 health articles from BBC News using named entity recognition and topic clustering. This pulled out the most frequent sort of terms that are used in these articles, and then they then generated 135 visual elements that could correspond to these varying terms. Additional 15 extra components were added for special cases, in this case mostly COVID related, given the timeline of the world at present. Each of these components then had several different ways it could be manipulated. They could be used both for leftward and rightward directions. They could be rotated clockwise and counterclockwise. They could vary in their size within the frame, whether it's zoomed in at a normal view or a distant or small view. It could also have multiple different positions within a panel and vary across several different types of color templates. If you look at all of these factors across the direction, rotation, size, color, and position of these components, what you end up with is each component has 360 different manipulations that can be used in. Now, if a panel can have 1 to 3 components in it, if you have an average of, say, 1.5 components per panel, across these 250 different components, you get 93,750 different possible panels. Take into account then the 360 different manipulations per component, you end up with around 2 billion different possible panels that can be generated. Now, Not all of these combinations might make sense or could be feasible. However, the system is generatively powerful enough to generate many different types of comic panels given the needs of the help desk. Some samples of this might be things like this. If a news story mentions numerical data, you might get something of a fraction that's represented by the people themselves. You might say a percentage that can give you an actual graph. And you might say something like the word doubled could cue just a ×2 sort of sign. Quotations, which of course feature prominently in news stories, generate panels like this where you have a schematic person giving that quote, or just a panel with a direct quotation in it. Based on these features, they started generating prototypes, which might look something like this. Those prototypes then underwent additional testing in the UK in May of this year. These again yielded very promising results. 80% of the participants reported positive ratings that these held their attention. 81% said that they were visually appealing. 86% said they would share them with friends, and 94% said the format is engaging. In fact, if you look at all of the different dimensions that they tested, whether it was related to charts and statistics, saying it's simple and straightforward, the use of the language was appropriate, it was easy to understand, ease of use, etc., all of these gained very positive ratings across all of these studies. This is included in direct comparisons between the graphic representations of the news comics and traditional news stories in textual form. When people are asked which format would be preferred, 69% said they would prefer the graphical format. Based on this, they then entered phase 3 of this project, where they are now actively automatically generating news comics based on journalists' stories. So here is an example of one of these automatically generated news comics. This is another one. They keep getting better and better to the point where at this point, they intend on launching this as a public endeavor of news comics later in this summer or in the fall. So this is now rapidly approaching the point where you should be seeing these sorts of news comics in your Instagram feeds coming soon. So all of this shows that the system is feasible. There seems to be fairly few barriers to iteration improvement, and that it holds quite a bit of potential for greater sophistication, such that you might see this sort of format becoming far more prevalent across news stories later on. This is also a great example of how theories from cognitive science can inform practical uses in communication more widely. If you want to know more information about this project, you can go to bbcnewslabs.co.uk. You can also find more about my work at visuallanguagelab.com or follow me on Twitter at @visual_linguist online. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.